Let's look at the latest news this hour. The southern border remains tense. Hezbollah fired some 30 rockets into northern Israel last night. The air raid sirens sounded. Most people have been evacuated from this area over the past year, but some are reaching beyond the areas declared military zones by Israel.
Hezbollah, in its response, claimed a successful strike on Israeli soldiers in northern Israel with a large rocket salvo, though these claims remain unconfirmed.
In Lebanon, where Israeli bombardment continued overnight. Some 30 strikes were reported on the Lebanese capital, Beirut. We can see a picture of the Beirut skyline here when the attacks were taking place. Lebanese media described, as you can see, the attacks as very violent. You can see the plumes of smoke rising. There were more than 30 attacks in southern suburbs of Beirut. Hezbollah has a strong presence there, but it's a densely populated residential area too. Residents were filmed fleeing in panic as people tried to find safety.
The intensity of the assault has led to civilian casualties and widespread displacement. Lebanese government is urgently calling for international intervention, pleading for a ceasefire to prevent further bloodshed.
They don't have red lines. They never had red lines. They didn't have red lines in Gaza, and they won't have red lines in Lebanon. But in Lebanon, military speaking, it will be harder on them to enter, and they are paying also a big price.
By Israel. Let's get a look at all the latest developments. We have this report from our correspondent, Will Vernon.
The bombing in Beirut goes on. Giant flames leapt into the night sky over the city's southern suburbs. Several secondary explosions appear to have been caused by the initial strikes. Shortly before the blasts, the Israeli military sent out an urgent warning to the area's residents that they should evacuate immediately. As the explosions continued, planes were still seen landing at Beirut airport. Today, another evacuation flight for British nationals is due to leave. The UK government says no more are planned. Just across the border, northern Israel also came under attack from Lebanon. The country's Iron Dome air defences were activated. And after this huge ballistic missile attack last week, the Israeli Prime Minister vowed revenge on Iran.
No country in the world would accept such an attack on its cities and citizens, and nor will Israel. Israel has the duty and the right to defend itself and respond to these attacks, and it will do so.
In Lebanon, urgently needed assistance is being rushed into the country. Aid agencies say the humanitarian situation is rapidly getting worse. This escalating conflict has now forced more than 1 million people from their homes, and with tensions rising across this region, it's ordinary civilians that are feeling the pain. Will Vernon, BBC News.
Well, let's get the latest now from Beirut this morning. We can join our correspondent there, Lina Sinjab. Lina, it's been described as the most violent night yet in Beirut after what have been many days of bombardments. Just tell us what it was like last night.
It was really apocalyptic, Liz. People felt that they are watching hell on earth. You know, the fire, the constant attacks, the fear, whether people who are in Dahya or surrounding Dahya, or even a little bit far from Dahya, the sound, the scene of it and the feel of these bombardments were terrible. Of course, this is not the first night that Lebanese are living these kind of horror moments. There have been nights and nights of sleepless hours for the Lebanese. Airstrikes overnight and, destruction during the day that they look after. They see, people fleeing. There are dead people. It's just an attack after the other. And for the Lebanese, really, it's obvious for them. It's not only an attack on Hezbollah or a defense of the southern border for the Israelis, but an expanded attack. This is how the Lebanese see it, to cripple Hezbollah and to stop any kind of resistance against Israel. And that could be a target anywhere, anytime, even in civilian areas.
And what are the reports from those areas this morning? Are emergency crews able to access the area to try to rescue the injured and take away any bodies if there have been people killed?
So far, there hasn't been reports of, emergency teams arriving on site, but we've seen in several, attacks, some of the sites, emergency teams haven't been able to reach because it's consecutive attacks after the other. Of course, residents in the area have been warned by the Israel Defense Forces. There were 3 warnings for evacuation of 8 neighborhoods, but the effect of these strikes is going beyond the neighborhoods or where the precise attacks are taking place. We've seen even outside Dahye, people are fleeing on foot, seeking, help and finding safety areas. So these are stories that are happening on a daily basis of running away for safety and daily efforts for rescue operation, for finding shelters and for treating the wounded or retrieving bodies.
Lina Sinjab, thank you very much for joining us with the latest from the capital, Beirut. Well, 1 year on, despite the growing calls for a ceasefire, most of all for Israelis to bring the hostages home, the situation continues to be one of escalation and mounting tension, not just here in Israel, but across the region, with Israel widely expected to retaliate for Iran's barrage of nearly 200 ballistic missiles, which was in itself a retaliatory strike. My colleague Laura Koonsberg has been speaking to Israel's ambassador to the UK this morning, Sipi Hotavelli, who outlined Israel's perspective right now.
So we're not interested to be under a missile threat from Iran. We're not interested to be under this ring of fire from the proxies. This is why we will dismantle the threat. This is for the cabinet to decide how. But we will dismantle the threat because no country will tolerate that.
But could that include a strike on Iran's nuclear facilities? Because that would, perhaps you would acknowledge this, many Western leaders think that would move the whole world into a new phase of danger. President Biden has asked Israel to rule out attacking Iran's nuclear sites. Will you?
We will do everything that will remove a threat, first. Second, if the world wants to prevent something like that, first of all, we need to prevent from Iran nuclear abilities, because if this is what Iran is doing without nuclear abilities, can you imagine what this regime of terror, this regime that killed and executed Masa Amini, that doesn't care about our values, that is against any Western and liberal values, can you imagine what this regime can do?
Israel's ambassador to Britain outlining Israel's war aims now, but even as the war intensifies across the border in Lebanon and also tensions escalate with Iran, the war in Gaza goes on. These are the latest developments. Now we can take a look at the map of that area where Israeli forces, they say they've encircled Jabalia in northern Gaza again, saying that Hamas was trying to rebuild its capabilities in the north. Israel says it struck dozens of targets before troops moved in, including weapons storage sites and underground infrastructure. And in central Gaza, at least 24 people were killed and dozens wounded after Israeli warplanes struck a mosque in Deir al-Balah. That's according to Palestinian media. Israel says Hamas had been using the compound as a command center, but eyewitnesses in the area said it was housing displaced people. The mosque was being used as a shelter. And beyond this region and around the world, pro-Palestinian marches are being held this weekend. This is the latest image from a march held in Sydney, Australia. All of them come, of course, just as this terrible anniversary, the 1 year on since the attacks of October 7th in southern Israel, in kibbutzes and in towns across this area, and triggered this current conflict that we are reporting on today. In a moment, we're going to speak to a resident of this community, this kibbutz of Nir Oz, but let's get the latest from our correspondent in Jerusalem, John Donnison.
People in Beirut saying that it was the worst night of this conflict so far. You had those massive explosions quite close to the airport, a huge fireball going up into the sky, some speculation that some sort of fuel depot, even a petrol station might have been hit, but it looked pretty scary, and those strikes have been going on into this morning. So Israel absolutely not letting up, and at the same time, as you said in your introduction, Hezbollah continuing to fire back.
And have Israel given any indication of what plans they have in their response that we're all expecting to the Iranian missile attack?
No, they haven't, but it's going to come. You know, it was a Jewish holiday in Israel for the Jewish New Year at the end of last week. That is now finished, and it's not a question of if, but when. So Israel has a range of targets it could go for. It could go for economic targets, so that could be oil refineries, power stations, that sort of thing, to try and hit Iran's economy. That would be at the low end of the scale. It could then obviously target Iran's nuclear facilities, something that the United States is very much urging caution on. And then at the top end, I guess, I spoke to a very senior former Israeli army general last week who said he didn't rule out possibly an assassination attempt on Iran's supreme leader. So that would obviously be a huge escalation. We don't know when it's going to happen. Prime Minister Netanyahu gave an address last night, and he said that the region was facing the forces of barbarism led by Iran. So that strike is going to come. We just don't know when.